Now, one way to show how that core fear operates in our life is the power of Satan himself, how he tries to create fear in us to control us. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 2, verse 14, it says, "Since the children have flesh and blood, Jesus too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil." Listen to this very carefully. "And free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death." Now notice what Satan does. Through the fear of death, a core fear, he can rob people of peace. He can control them. If you don't do this, you're going to die. And notice it says that Jesus came to break that fear, to break us of being robbed of our freedom in Christ. In Galatians 5, it says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." You see, Jesus doesn't want us enslaved to the fears that Satan promotes. If you remember in the book of John, Jesus talking to some of the religious leaders, and he says, "You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies." So we know something about Satan. He is the creator of the fear, but we also know he's the father of lies. So what does that tell you about the nature of fear ultimately? It is a lie, right? This accuser, this spirit of accusation, whether in an actual being or in someone else's mouth or in the media or your neighbor or with a voice within yourself, these lies of fear are accusing us and robbing us of the joy and the freedom that we could have in Christ. Think about what your fear is robbing you of right now. Now, once that fear happens, you have to find a truth that is greater than that fear. A truth that transcends, that rises above that fear. So, for example, in Matthew 6, I saw several transcendent truths that Jesus was trying to point to get us to rise above our fear. He says, your Father knows that you need these things. Right? That would be a truth. I'm worried about my survival, worried about getting my necessities. And he says, God knows you need these things. So don't get lost in that fear and the lies, but turn to the one who cares for you. He says, is life not more than food? That's a truth greater than your fear. He says, seek the kingdom and his righteousness. Again, a truth greater than our fears. Tomorrow will take care of itself. Focus on today. Don't be worried about tomorrow. Again, a transcendent truth. Today has enough trouble of its own. Again, another truth. So we can see in Matthew 6, Jesus making all these appeals to a truth greater than our fear. Now the question becomes, how do you discover your core fear? Well, some very simple things you can do. There's basically 3 questions you can ask that can help you get to your core fear. And you can ask them sequentially, one after another. You could just take one of these questions and just ask it over and over and over and over again. You don't have to ask all 3. The purpose of the 3 questions is just to help you get down to your core fear. The 3 questions are, why is that upsetting to you? What are you afraid of happening next? And what are you afraid you would lose or miss? Now you could ask those same 3 questions, just keep repeating them over and over, sequentially, or you could just keep asking, why is that upsetting to you? Why is that upsetting to you? Or, what are you afraid of happening next? What are you afraid of happening next? And every time you give a statement, a response to that question, keep asking the question until you land on one of those core fears. Now, Todd Pressman in his book gave one very simple example that I'd like to share with you here. The example he gave is the person stated their problem very simply. My boss is calling me in for a meeting in her office. So the question become, why is that upsetting to you? I'm afraid she might say something terrible. What are you afraid would happen next? I might get fired. What are you afraid you would miss or lose? I could end up on the streets. Now right there I might stop and say, his fear is fear of death. But he kept asking the question, why is that upsetting to you, being on the streets? Well, I would lose respect in my friends and my family. What are you afraid would happen next? I would be a nobody. I would have no identity. You see, it wasn't the fear of death that drove this person. It was their fear of losing their identity, of being respected. Their core fear was the loss of identity. Now, his chief defense was he became a workaholic, worked all kinds of crazy hours, did more than what he should have done. And what did that rob him of? What was the cost? It robbed him of his family, his marriage, and peace of mind, because of the fear of losing his identity. Now, he could have risen above that core fear with the transcendent truth that his life is in the hands of God, that he would not lose his identity. Ultimately, there is a challenge between two things: fear on one hand and love on the other. Listen to these words from 1 John chapter 4. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God and God in them. This is how love is made complete among us, that we will have confidence on the day of judgment. In this world we are like Jesus. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. There is a set of transcendent truths that when we have fear, we're not relying on the love of God. Now, don't use that as a way of beating yourself up. Oh, I have fear. I don't love God enough. Recognize that it's the love of God in your life that you need to turn to, that you need to promote more in life and meditate on. So here's what I like to do this week and give you a challenge. Here's your challenge for the week. I want you to go through this exercise yourself. You'll simply state your problem in a short and specific statement, and then repeatedly ask the following questions to try to get to the core fear until it's obvious and clear. So you state your problem and then ask those three questions. Why is that upsetting to me? What am I afraid of happening next? What am I afraid I would miss or lose? And you keep asking that until you land on one of those core fears. Then simply ask yourself, what is the main way I try to avoid this fear in my life? What does it cause you to do? That's your chief defense. And then you ask, how has this fear robbed me of being free and fulfilled? What has been the cost of having that fear in your life? And what absolute truth do you believe could rise above that fear? If you're willing to go through that exercise yourself, then I would like you to record that message if you could and share it with us. And we'll post those. It doesn't have to be a long explanation. Just state the problem. Here's my core fear. Here's how I worked against it. Here's what it robbed me of. Here's the truth that rises above it. Now let me give you a quick example of how that worked in my life so you can see how this works. I was afraid that I would not pass what is called the National Counselor's Exam. Now, you have to pass this exam, all right? That was my fear in order for me to be a counselor. Now, I went through those three questions. Why is that upsetting to me? And I just kept asking that. I said, well, it's upsetting to me because if I don't pass that exam, I can't be a counselor. Why is that upsetting to you, Terry? Well, I'd waste all this money. Well, why is that upsetting to you? Well, because the whole purpose of studying and taking this test is to be a counselor. Well, what are you afraid you would miss or lose? Well, all that education I did, all this time. The clock is ticking with Westmain. I got to be able to live. But why is that upsetting to you, Terry? Well, I would lose my purpose. The whole purpose of doing this was to be a counselor. Do you see it? I was afraid of losing my purpose. What was my chief defense? Oh, I studied like you wouldn't believe. I kept studying, and the cost of that is it robbed me. What did it rob me of? Peace of mind. It also robbed me of a couple $100 because I kept postponing the test thinking I wasn't ready. What was the truth that could rise above that? That even if I didn't pass the test, I didn't lose my purpose. I still had purpose with God. It wouldn't be the end of the world if I didn't pass that test. I could take it again. Would I be disappointed? Sure. But there is a truth greater than my fear. But you see, I wasn't trusting in that. I was robbed of that freedom. So those are two examples that I've given you that you can work on your core fear. I hope this helps you this week, and I hope you take up the challenge to share what your core fear is, what your chief defense is, what did it rob you of, and what is the transcendent truth that rises above it all. Do not be afraid, brothers and sisters of Westmain.